Hi, everyone. My name is Charlie Penn. I am the Relationships and Wellness Director here at Essence Magazine. So look, the recent and shocking headlines this week regarding Kanye West, who is bipolar, have once again brought the Black mental health conversation to the forefront of the news. And we need to talk more about it. Today, we're going to learn more about bipolar disorder and how we can help loved ones who may be suffering from it with the help of a very special guest, psychiatrist, beauty expert, and TV personality, Dr. Imani Walker. Welcome, Dr. Walker. How are you?
Hi, how are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for being here today to talk about such an important topic.
Sure, of course.
I'm sure you've been following the headlines. We all have. As a professional psychiatrist, I'm sure you have a lot to say, so let's dig in.
Okay.
So with Kanye currently trending right now in the news, the realities of bipolar disorder are being discussed more openly. For those who don't know, can you first break down exactly what bipolar disorder is?
Sure. So bipolar disorder is a disorder, obviously, that is under the heading of mood disorders, right? Mm-hmm. So a mood disorder basically describes how the person is feeling both inside and what we or me, the psychiatrist, can see. So if I ask you, how are you doing? Mm-hmm. Like you could answer the question.
I'm good.
Okay, so you're good, right? So I would say your mood is reported as good, and your affect, or what I see of you when you answer that question, is your affect, right? Mm-hmm. So when it comes to bipolar disorder, it basically means there is a split sometimes, or a schism between what the person reports and what we can see on their face or their behaviors. So bipolar disorder describes the fact that there are two poles, right? So they're just like there's on a battery, there's like the plus side and the negative side. Yeah. Let's say in this situation, the plus side of the battery would be mania, which is a state of being ecstatic. Oftentimes they get very irritable. They may have racing thoughts. That's one of the hallmarks of bipolar disorder, meaning that if I'm seeing a patient, I will say, hi, do you feel like the thoughts in your head are moving really fast? And they'll say yes. A lot of times when people are experiencing racing thoughts, they will also experience or display what's called pressured speech. And that is when their speech is very, very rapid, and you can understand them sometimes, but it's almost like they just keep talking like they didn't even stop to take in a breath of air. And as it relates to Kanye, that's really what we saw on Sunday at his presidential rally, right? So the other thing that comes with racing thoughts, and you can kind of just like think about this sensically, the person can also experience what's called anxiety. Yeah. So when the person has racing thoughts, they have anxiety, they're speaking really fast. I will ask them straight out, like, oh, do you have mood swings? A lot of times people will say yes. Sometimes they'll say no, but that's really has to do with the fact that they may not want to share as much with me in the very beginning. When bipolar disorder gets really bad, the person can also experience what are known as grandiose delusions. Mm-hmm. So I spoke about this, I think, yesterday, but there was in some of the tweets that Kanye put out on Monday, I think, he said, just so everyone knows, the movie Get Out was about me.
I saw that one. Yeah.
It wasn't, but in his mind at the time of being in a manic episode, he truly believed that. And that's a delusion. So delusions, real quick, are a firm, fixed, false belief. So anytime I encounter someone with any type of delusion, sometimes people get paranoid delusions. I think Kanye was kind of displaying that a little bit. I can't recall the tweet that he had made, but it definitely seemed like, okay, this is someone who is really afraid for his life because he doesn't want his wife around him or doctors around him or his family around him. And paranoid delusions are another kind of delusion that people can experience when bipolar disorder, and this is type 1, mm-hmm. very bad. Something else that can happen when people have bipolar disorder, and progresses to a very heightened state is patients can experience what's known as psychosis or hallucinations. So hallucinations, the most common are audio, or when you hear voices or sounds. Another common one, but not as common, are visual hallucinations. And that's when, the person believes that they're seeing shapes or objects or figures. And sometimes people even can experience what are known as tactile, which is touch hallucinations, even though someone or nothing's on them. And another less common hallucination, but it can happen, are olfactory delusions, when the person can smell certain things. So there are a lot of symptoms in the cluster or constellation of bipolar disorder, and it can be very difficult for someone who's going through it. It can be very difficult for someone, who loves this person who may be experiencing a manic episode. But most importantly, what's very important is that if you feel that you are going through this, or you have a friend or family member that's going through this, it's important to get them professional help from a mental health clinician or a psychiatrist, or, therapy. But in a lot of situations, when it comes to severe mental illness like Kanye's experiencing, it really does help if he starts taking medication.
So one of the things I heard you say, Dr. Imani, that I think is really interesting is that when you're bipolar, you can think that you are fine and believe that you are fine and not be, which I also think is something that we saw playing out. And that it's really interesting because I didn't realize that was a component.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, for sure. It's called, in psychiatry, it's called lack of insight. So the person, or let's use Kanye as an example. He was saying, "Oh, my wife was trying to fly out here to Wyoming, I think, and bring a doctor so they could put me on a 5150." That actually is a symptom of bipolar disorder. So it's something that it's hard to tease out. And I understand how frustrating it can be, but that's really where trained professionals come into play.
And let's talk about that too, and trained professionals, because right now this is a trending topic. It's really uncomfortable and unfortunate for us all to see play out. And many people have expressed, care for him and his family and concern, but then there also been a lot of people making jokes, making memes and really just being inappropriate. So let's talk about some of the stigma surrounding bipolar, and then what we need to understand to have empathy and to handle people who may be bipolar the right way.
So one of the things that I try to explain to my patients is the fact that, when something like this happens, and let's say, and this happens very often, by the way, as far as this example I'm about to give. So someone gets brought to the hospital I work at, and they're just, very manic, very irritable, won't sleep. Oh, sorry. That's one other thing. People who are bipolar have a decreased need for sleep. So they'll oftentimes sleep for a couple hours. And then as soon as they wake up, they're like, yay, they're supercharged. And I'll ask someone are you tired today? Even though you slept 2 hours, they're like, no, I feel great. So in any case, it's really wild. So in any case, I'm sorry, ask me the question again, because I got sidetracked.
No, I get it. It's a lot to talk about. So in terms of how we, the public, the internet, how we handle these things and what we should be aware of when we're possibly watching somebody have a manic episode.
Right. So the most important thing is really to take this seriously, right? And I know on Sunday people were like, oh, this is so funny and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, it really, really isn't. It's really, really similar to, and this is what I was saying earlier. I may have a patient and they're like, well, oh my God, what's wrong with me? And why won't this stop? And this is especially when they go from the mania to the depression, right? So I'll say to them, listen, it's not your fault, but what's happening is that your brain and the electrical impulses in your brain are just causing your brain to be what Kanye actually expressed really nicely as having a sprained brain. So there are chemicals, neurochemicals, and electrical impulses involved when it comes to bipolar disorder. So I'll say to my patients, hey, if you came in here and you had a broken leg, and I laughed at you about it, oh, you know what, girl, just go ahead and hobble yourself back home. That makes no sense, right?
Right.
It's the same dynamic. It's this person, just because you can't see physical scars, or the person isn't howling in pain, or there isn't something that you can see directly, that doesn't mean that the person isn't going through these very severe symptoms.
Absolutely. And they're not the only ones going through it, right? We're seeing family, and in Kanye's case, it's Kim, it's his children, his loved ones. But for anyone who's suffering from bipolar disorder, their families and loved ones are also affected. So can you talk a little bit about how it sort of affects their world?
Sure. And one of the things that I did stress on Twitter on Sunday, I believe, is the fact that, like you said, it's something that can impact an entire family. I actually have members of my family who have bipolar disorder, and, some of them are treated, some of them are, not taking medication. So, when it comes to dealing with someone who has bipolar disorder, it can be very, very hard because, again, you can't see what's going on in the person's mind, because the person who's afflicted or going through the illness will say things that are very mean, unsavory. And when they say these things and they're in the midst of a manic episode, once they're better, I've been treating patients for 10 plus years, they really don't remember. Like, there are patients where they're in the hospital for a few days and they start to kind of come down because of the medications I prescribed. And they'll wake up and say, where am I and who are you and what happened? So when they get really, really sick and manic and euphoric, which is also another symptom of bipolar disorder, sometimes they can lose stretches of time. And that's very scary to them. And it's very scary, or it can be very bothersome for family and friends, because you may go up to, the person who's sick and be like, yo, do you remember what happened 2 days ago when you said, that I was fill in the blank? And they're like, no. And that can trigger the family to be like, why don't you remember? That's crazy. Like, you should remember this. Like, this happened 2 days ago or yesterday. And they're like, yeah, I don't remember. And so it turns, what could be a healing moment sometimes into a non-healing moment. And it can really, aggravate the person who's afflicted, because now you're telling them essentially that they were lying. So
Absolutely.
It's really, really hard. I've treated a lot of bipolar patients over the years, and they really, really struggle with it. Even sometimes, I'll put them on the best medications, and just like anyone else, so there's medications I have to take sometimes, and I might be like, oh my God, did I take that today? And when it comes to these types of people who have bipolar disorder, they'll do the same thing. Like, oh, well, I feel stable. I've had patients say, oh, well, so since I'm stable, I can stop taking this, right? And I always have to say, well, you know why you're stable? It's because of the medications. Mm-hmm. And you need to keep taking these medications, or your symptoms will start to worsen again, and you may have to come back into the hospital.
I'm glad that you brought up, Dr. Imani, working with other patients, because that was going to be one of my next questions. While we are seeing this right now play out, for example, with Kanye in a way that's sort of heartbreaking to watch, there are people living every day with bipolar disorder who are surviving and thriving. So can you talk a little bit about that, and then the stigmas like this that are attached to that?
Sure. I tell my patients, I'm like, look, your personal medical information, like your medical history, you don't have to let the whole world know unless you really want to, right? So just like, I'm not running around telling people like, oh, you know what, I have acid reflux sometimes. That's just, if it comes up in conversation, maybe, but it's not something that I need to run around telling people. So what I try to stress to my patients is, they already know there's a stigma. They've already felt the, ramifications of having to deal with a disorder that they may not always understand. So I'll say to them, like, listen, you know what? All you're responsible for is you and the therapy and the medications that are tailored for you, right? So if you want to tell people, if you want to try to help, that's fine. But you also can just go on and live a normal life and just take medications. I'm like, look, everybody at some point in their life has to take medications consistently. This is just to keep your mood at a stable level, or to have what we call in psychiatry a stable mood. But the stigma is very, very real. And outside of the fact that when these people are in the throes of mania, and they don't remember, and then if they do end up being made to feel bad because they don't remember, that's where a lot of the stigma comes from. And also just to bring your point home, there are a lot of patients that you guys would never even know, like work at the Home Depot or the barber shop or the grocery store. Like we are probably interacting with more people who have mental illness than we're aware of, which I think is good. But we also have to keep in mind that we really are going to have to be the ones, or honestly, the generation to be like, you know what, this isn't funny. This is real. And we need to learn the language to discuss this, because even though I've been loving the fact that Black folks have been like, you know what, I need to get my mental health in check. I need to get my self-care in check. Like if you're really struggling with an illness, just like any other illness, you need to go get help. Because, for example, if you break your leg or you have acid reflux, that may not interfere with your job and your life. Right? Some people get so sick that they can't provide food, clothing, or shelter for themselves. There's people who become so paranoid, they won't eat. They won't leave the room. They won't bathe. They won't, they're afraid of the telephone ringing. So it's really, really sad, but it's not incurable. And that's something that I really just want to stress to everybody watching. They can get help and they can get better. They just have to be consistent with their medications or their therapy. So, I hope that with just this generation, we're able to erase the stigma surrounding all types of mental illness.
I hope so too. And I'm glad that we talked about, what we shouldn't do, which is laugh and make fun of and retweet. And, we saw people showing up to his rally just to laugh, right? To do these kinds of things. But what can we do? Because it is important for us to continue to have awareness surrounding mental health, particularly in the Black community. So what should we be on the lookout for if perhaps there may be someone in our life who could be depressed or bipolar or worse? What signs should we be looking out for, and how can we best support them?
So I talked a little bit about bipolar disorder. So I'll just run off the symptoms real quick. In a manic state, right, person can experience euphoria, which is like, oh my God, everything is so awesome. I feel amazing. It's actually one of my patients, former patients, told me that it's kind of like taking a stimulant, and you don't want the high to go away. So it's like you're high on a stimulant without even having taken anything. So they feel euphoria. They, lack of need to sleep. They can have mood swings. Sometimes bipolar disorder can get so bad that someone is laughing and crying at the same time. And that's called rapid cycling bipolar disorder type 1. Other issues are that, impulsivity, huge symptom. So if I had a patient once, I said this the other day, this person went and bought a car that they couldn't afford. And so I'll ask patients like, have you ever spent a lot of money on something or just stuff? And then you realize a couple of days later, I got to take this back because I have no money. I had a patient back in the day who spent $1,000 on socks, and someone else who actually spent $750 on, and this was a long time ago, those CDs, the blank CDs from back in the day.
I remember, yeah.
And so I was like, did you have to take that back? And he was like, yeah, I had to take all that back because
all kinds of impulsive behavior,
all kinds of impulsive behaviors. And what we saw on Sunday with Kanye, whether it was at the rally or when he started tweeting later on in the next day, when you're impulsive, it's like you got to get everything out. You got to get everything out, right? Yeah. And when most of us speak, or when we write things or text, we think about, okay, let me get my thoughts in order so that I can figure out how I want to express myself. When people are afflicted with bipolar disorder, that doesn't always happen. So they're just like, I got to get this out, get this out, get this out. Now, the opposite pole of bipolar disorder is depression. Okay. Depression, sometimes it's easier to spot than other times, but obviously the person is experiencing dysthymia, or what we know as depressed mood. The person may have issues with shame and guilt. The person may have issues with insomnia or hypersomnia. The person may also complain of a lack of energy, decreased concentration, decreased motivation, and I'm sorry. And also any thoughts of suicidality or coming up with a plan to commit suicide. And when it gets to that point, that's when you really need to call like emergency services and have that person evaluated in the community, or you can always take that person to an emergency room and then they can be evaluated by the doctors there. But essentially what I would like to stress to people is, mental illness affects all of us, including me. I have depression and anxiety. I take Prozac every day. I was talking to one of my friends the other day and I said, you know what? She has diabetes. She has type 1 diabetes. And I said, you know what? Just like your body needs insulin, my body needs serotonin. Mm-hmm. And that's it. Like, and there's no, like, that's the end of the conversation. There's no stigma around. It's just like, those are the facts. Yeah. And because of my genetic makeup and my family, I just happen to, end up with depression and anxiety, and it's okay. And I feel better. And I'm happy that I was able to have some insight into my mental illness and take the medications. But, just like we talk about cancer being serious or, autoimmune diseases, like we just need to restructure our minds to understand that this really is, it can be a very debilitating state for the person to be in. And some people, because they keep lacking that insight, ultimately they may have to be appointed someone who can look over their affairs because they won't take their medications and they keep being impulsive and they keep going in and out of the hospital. So, what myself as a psychiatrist deals with is very serious, but it doesn't always have to be so sad. I actually do have a lot of fun at work because I'm kind of goofy. And I think that, my ability to kind of make my patients laugh is something that I need to see, because even though it's fun for me, if I can see them laugh, for example, I know that they're getting better.
Absolutely. Well, laughing is good for all of us, right?
Right. It is. I'm just like, listen, you guys are not like, you're not a leper. Like you're not someone who needs to be socially shunned. Like you just have an imbalance and here's some medication and, a few days later, you're great and good. Like, but I'm like, just please keep taking the medication because I don't want to see you back here. But if you need to come back, I'll be here.
And you touched on something in your last response that I think is a really important note to end on. So as much as we want to help people and there are moments where we may need to intervene, can you just break down as best you can? And I know this may be difficult because it may be, a very personal thing depending on the person, but how do we say to someone, I think you need help? Or I'm asking, do you feel depressed? Do you feel suicidal? Or how do you know when it's time to pick up the phone and maybe have to have them committed? Or is that even possible for an adult?
Yeah, that's a really good question because, fortunately for me, because this is my job, but unfortunately for a potential patient, I often see them when their symptoms have reached like a peak level, right? But what I would say to someone who may be experiencing these symptoms, or to a friend or family member who loves someone who's having these symptoms, one of the things that I ask my patients all the time, they're like, oh my God, like, Dr. Walker, please stop asking me the same question. But I'm like, do you get sleep at night? Because when people are manic and they don't sleep, they can ramp themselves up and go and go and go. And sometimes, like I explained earlier, their symptoms can get so bad that they start to hallucinate or become delusional. And I spoke a little bit about them being, some people become paranoid. And I've had patients who they hadn't eaten in like a week or longer, and they've lost all this weight. So I would say the first thing that I would, really implore people to pay attention to is if someone they know is, having issues with sleep. Doesn't mean that it's bipolar disorder, but it's something to look out for. Also, if the person, if you see them just kind of like just doing impulsive things, like, when when someone is doing something out of character, right? Mm-hmm. And I know that these symptoms aren't quantifiable, but we need to really kind of understand like what the qualitative symptoms are. So they can't sleep or they don't need to sleep. They may, like I said, do really impulsive things. Their moods can go back and forth depending upon, who the person is. It can take like maybe 1 day of mania and then a whole 30 days of depression. Right. But you really just kind of have to be in tune with who the person is, because that's that's really like the best way to kind of gauge like, oh, is this person okay? And I think more so than anything, we really just need to normalize, the conversation around mental health, right, and mental illness. Like I would hope. And one of the things that I've been trying to make very plain to people is, like, I'm going to teach you guys the vocabulary necessary so that when it comes time for you to contact a mental health professional, or you want to take, your friend, your family, or yourself to a medical facility, that you know how to explain it, right? Absolutely. So, it's going to take some time, but I will say that as somebody who's middle-aged, I'm very, very proud of the millennial generation, because they're like, yeah, I'm in therapy, and I go to therapy like twice.
I love it. They're my best friend, right?
I got this app, and then on Thursdays I talk to this person, and they're very, very, like, millennials are very, very in touch with their feelings. So I'm really happy that they can kind of lead the way, because even me as a non-millennial, when I was, about to get prescribed some medication, like earlier this year, I was like, but I didn't have the best insight. So yeah.
You're right about millennials. We are guilty. We dive into all the apps, all the things, right? Yeah, Dr. Imani, we have a question that came in. It's a really great one. It's from Rose. She asks, are there specific symptoms? Are the symptoms different between women and men?
The symptoms aren't different, but the time when the symptoms can start, it tends to be younger in males. So males, anywhere from like late teens to early to mid 20s is when you'll start to see if the person is going to have bipolar symptoms. That's when those symptoms are most prevalent. So something like a really good example that I can give you guys is that I see a lot of patients, and a lot of them have like mood swings and bipolar disorder and what have you. And I'll always ask them, which is part of a psychiatric intake, like, not just when did your symptoms start, but if you went to school, if you went to college, did you finish? Because a lot of times people will enter, or these men will enter college, and then their symptoms start to act up and they can't finish. So I see that a lot. Right. And it's something that, had I not been a psychiatrist and been exposed to so many people over the past, 10 plus years, like, that's the correlation. I'm like, oh, so you didn't finish. I'm like, well, did something happen? They're like, oh yeah, my symptoms started to act up. Now in women, bipolar disorder tends to occur a little bit later. Doesn't mean that it can't occur sooner, but the symptoms start to really become more prevalent in the mid 20s onward. So, what I wish I could say that when someone has bipolar symptoms, men or women, the later that they get it, like the easier it is for people to deal with. But a lot of times there is no correlation between age and severity. They either start to have those symptoms or they don't. And another thing to keep in mind is, even though maybe even because I said I have bipolar disorder in my family, I might have the code for bipolar disorder in my DNA. But a lot of times bipolar disorder can be exacerbated or kind of start, let's say, due to environmental factors. So the loss of a loved one, a lot of stress,
traumas,
family. Right. So when people have said like, oh, Kanye's not over grieving his mother, I'm like, maybe he wasn't, maybe he was exhibiting symptoms before, but they were milder. And maybe when his mother died, that was the event that caused him or caused his brain to be like, okay, you know what? I can't deal with this. Let me give you some symptoms, unfortunately.
Dr. Imani, we cannot thank you enough. This was such an important conversation. Before you go, please tell everyone if they want to reach out to you, if they have more questions, where they can find you and how they can listen to your podcast, which I hear is right on time for this moment.
Oh, yes. Okay. So my name is Dr. Imani. I am a psychiatrist, and you can find me mostly on Instagram. My Instagram name is Dr. Imani. You can also find me on Twitter where it's Dr._Imani. And most importantly, I think, especially as you mentioned to this topic, I do have a podcast called Imani State of Mind, and it is produced by Stitcher Network, and it's on every platform that you could possibly think of to listen to podcasts. This week, meaning today it dropped, is actually the bipolar episode where I break down bipolar disorder a little bit more than I could here, because we obviously have time constraints. But also I talk about pop culture, and I talk about different TV shows where a character may have admitted that they have bipolar disorder and how it manifested itself on the show, and what take homes we can garner from this person's portrayal of having bipolar disorder on TV.
So everyone, be sure to go and listen to Dr. Imani's podcast. It sounds incredible. I know I will be. And if you have more questions for her, feel free to keep leaving them in the comments. She'll be sure to stop back by and check them out and do her best to respond after the show. Dr. Imani, thank you again for taking a moment to talk about something so important. We appreciate you, and thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much.